On this episode of Live Open Daily, we have a whole list of game updates to go through, including the end of Zenith Nexus, aka Zenith the Last City, aka Zenith Infinite Realms, a last-second delay for a new story-based shooter, an old Oculus Rift game I talked about before is getting the Quest release, new information on Metro Awakening for Vertigo Games, the makers of Frax, Synapse, and Ghostbusters Rise of the Ghost Lord are making a new shooter, and not one, not two, but 3 new survival games are heading for early access. I'm your host Live Open Mike, and we're going to start with the end of Zenith Nexus, which actually launched as Zenith the Last City, VR's pretty much most ambitious MMORPG. The founding developers of Ramen VR actually put out a video on their YouTube channel basically explaining, while thanking the fans for all of their support, that they were going to be ending active development on Zenith after the next update, which comes out next month. In this video, they were pretty transparent about the fact that despite all their best efforts, including overhauling the game entirely and making Zenith the Last City a paid DLC to what became Zenith Nexus, I'll talk more about that in a minute, basically their player count was dropping too fast and nothing that they were doing was bringing new players into the game. They were pretty open on their blog, on social media, and on Reddit about the fact that even though they were very well funded from the start, they had a very successful Kickstarter campaign and they got a lot of investments up front when The Last City first came out, that they were operating at a loss for what now is going to be well over 2 years, and unfortunately doesn't make financial sense to continue to actively develop the game. No matter what their efforts were, including overhauling the entire game into what became Zenith Nexus, the player count continued to drop. They did post a FAQ on their website that answered a bunch of questions. I'll just run through a few of these real quick to give you the basic information, and then we'll talk about what became Zenith Nexus and how we got there from Zenith the Last City. First question, why did Ramen VR decide to stop new content development for Zenith? Answer, Zenith has struggled with retaining players since very early on. Even though we've had hundreds of thousands of players, the vast majority of them stopped playing Zenith after about a month. Despite our best efforts over the 5.5 years of development and well before Infinite Realms launched, we weren't able to improve retaining players. Zenith started losing money and it isn't feasible to continue running it at a loss. Ramen VR remains deeply committed to its core mission of building games in online worlds. We've decided we need to focus on new projects that bring us closer to realizing that vision. Next question, is Zenith shutting down? Answer, no, we'll keep Zenith the Last City and Zenith Infinite Realms shards running for the foreseeable future. The community will be the first to know far in advance if that changes. Next question, will Zenith get any more content updates? Season 4 is planned for August 2024 with new Infinite Realm layouts plus bug fixes for the top issues across the Last City and Infinite Realms. After Season 4, we're stopping new content development on Zenith. We'll continue to address urgent bugs as they arise, but won't be actively building new content, seasons, or game systems. Next question, are there refunds for Zenith purchases? Zenith is the in-game currency that they introduced when they rolled out Infinite Realms. Answer is no, but we are planning to grant rewards in the form of gifts or downloadable content in a future Ramen VR project to those who purchase Zenith. Next question, how long will Zenith stay online? Answer, we don't have a scheduled end date for shards, but we'll let players know far in advance. The costs of maintaining servers are pretty significant, but we want to make sure the players who love Zenith have plenty of time left to enjoy it. While development of new content will end after Season 4, there's tons of content in Infinite Realms and The Last City. Now talk about how we came from Zenith The Last City, the game that originally launched for I think it was $30, up to where we're at now. I'm just going to read more from this blog entry from February 1st when they first announced Zenith Nexus and what that was going to be. We broke down Zenith into its best and worst parts, debated for hours and hours over weeks and months about what can and can't make it into Zenith Nexus, what pieces worked well and what didn't. We evaluated how we can best provide polished content with a small, passionate team. We poured over the player data and written feedback, noting where players spent most of their time and where they were churning, leaving the game never to return again. We observed the direction of the VR market and its growing younger audience. Reimagining Zenith was an incredibly arduous process, and now where we've landed is looking quite different, but we are genuinely thrilled by the prospects of this new direction. So looking forward, what does this mean for Zenith? Introducing Nexus. Zenith Nexus will be the collective name for our 2 game modes, Zenith the Last City and Zenith Infinite Realms. Zenith Nexus will be free, opening the door to millions of new players. Your game will automatically update to Zenith Nexus when we launch the next update. Zenith the Last City, the open world VR MMO we all know and love. This is not going anywhere and will still be available for purchase at the same price as DLC. Existing Zenith players obviously retain their ownership of the Last City and any progress they made prior. Then Zenith Infinite Realms, a new season-based, free-to-play procedural action-adventure RPG with co-op sessions, a revamped locomotion system that pushes the boundaries of immersive play, redesigned social playground, and more. And then Zenith, we talked about this a second ago, a new virtual currency coming to Zenith. This is to allow players more opportunities to express themselves and access seasonal content. A small cosmetic shop will be available when Zenith Infinite Realms launches, with more being added all the time. Going free to play will boost the social multiplayer experience. The new virtual currency in shop will open an avenue for revenue we've never had before. With an arcade-like experience that's more accessible than ever, we're inviting millions of new players to Zenith Nexus and potentially The Last City too. The decisions we made to get here we do not take lightly. We take full ownership of what Zenith The Last City succeeded and failed at and aim to bring all its learnings into Infinite Realms and beyond. And then they thank their community and all the platitudes and yada yada yada. So what happened here? Basically, they put out an MMORPG that had no microtransactions or any kind of in-game currency built into it. They were just charging the original flat price of $30, which honestly for a VR game, even though there's a ton of content in it and a ton of things to do, is still considered steep by a lot of people in the VR community, which has a massive discount culture we've talked about for a very long time. If you're going to make a social multiplayer game, unfortunately, you probably need to be either really cheap or free to play and bake all your revenue stuff into the game itself, a la something like Gorilla Tag. I'm not saying this is the only model that works, but we've seen other multiplayer games come out at a fairly high price and fail to find an audience. Inverse is another good example of that. That's the 4v1 asymmetrical game a la Dead by Daylight. They had to drop their price super low very quickly after they launched. The original price of that game was $30. It dropped very quickly. And they even said in their Discord that basically they listened to the player feedback and to get more people into the game, they were dropping the price to make it more accessible. Zenith pretty much went through the same thing. If you're making a massively multiplayer online RPG, you need as many people in that game as possible. That's how you set up guilds and quest lines and things like that. But if your player count is super low and you're having trouble getting people into the game, you've basically got a dead game at that point, and that's especially so for an MMORPG. Moreover, with a team the size of Ramen, this was not a very large team to begin with, even though they expanded very quickly once they got investors. To be able to keep up with the amount of content that MMO and MMO fans actually demand, you needed a large team to churn and burn through that. Or what ends up happening is you release, unfortunately what happened with Zenith, quite a few buggy launches. The bug list in Zenith's Discord is a mile long and they've done a really good job of getting through all those and taking care of them in future patches, but it does erode trust with your player base if most of your updates that come out are pretty buggy and then you end up having players who are going to wait until the first patch before they actually jump back in. You do that enough times and you get to a point where you can't get any traction on your latest update because everyone just expected to be riddled with issues. When I first heard about Infinite Realms, I took it as a last second Hail Mary to basically save this game because the player count was dropping so fast and they weren't getting new players back in. And they said as much in this video that creating Zenith Nexus, making it go free to play, making Last City DLC, all these moves that in Infinite Realms were really just the last chance to make Zenith a profitable game because they were operating at a loss for so long. And frankly, keeping servers online is very expensive, like I talked about in that FAQ post. Zenith was the biggest hope the VR community had for a full-blown MMORPG. There are other examples out there like Orbis VR and Alicia VR, but none of them had the scope and the scale of what Zenith was actually going for. It's unfortunate that it didn't work out because my fear is that this will deter other developers who are looking into doing more MMO type stuff to not do that because to date the highest profile version of this basically has failed. So if you are a Zenith fan, the game's going to still be online for quite a while, but after next month on Infinite Realms there will not be any new content, and then Last City and Infinite Realms will just get bug fixes. Our next story is about Witchblood from Hidden Path Entertainment. I talked about this game earlier this week on another podcast. The podcast focused on games on the Oculus Rift store that need to be ported to Quest because they were basically just left there to rot and die. Witchblood is basically being re-released as a new mixed reality game for Quest. It's not going to be 3D mixed reality like the other game that came out last year, The Meter, where you're actually using like your play space to move your character around. Instead, it looks like you're going to be in a mixed reality environment and there's going to be like a flat panel on your screen where you are playing the original game that came from Rift. For what I saw in the video footage, and I'll put some of that over this for the people who are watching the video version of this podcast, it looks to be pretty much the exact same game. I'll recognize all these rooms and some of the enemies that the character is fighting, just presented in the mixed reality environment. Reading from the press release real quick, players will explore an intricate magical diorama brimming with hidden treasures, challenging puzzles, formidable foes, and powerful spells. With more than 6 hours of exploration and combat, hundreds of rooms, 40 upgrades, and 4 difficulty levels to master, Witchblood transforms classic gaming and brings it to VR. With the charm and heart of beloved classics, Witchblood is the story of a young witch who must master newfound powers after her father is slain by a jealous madman. Traveling through mystical puzzle landscapes in all directions, she must defeat an oppressive cult and dangerous creatures to reveal the mysteries of her origin and claim the power of her birthright. Witchblood will release on July 18th, that is next week. Like I said in the other podcast, I love to see this. I would like to see more Metroidvania style games come to VR. There's only a small handful like Genotype and the second Upedigrad game, and I love to see more games you can actually sit down playing on Quest. While VR is generally an active medium, there is a large segment of people who don't really want to be that active and would like to play a game that's a little bit more casual. This game is fairly challenging in spots. I played the entire version on Rift, but having the comfort of being able to sit down in your favorite gaming chair or on your couch and play it makes it a little bit more easy to endure. Even though I already own this game, I will be picking up the Quest version because I do want to support more games like this. Next story, Destiny 2 is coming to virtual reality. Sort of. Kinda. Not really. No, this isn't Bungie jumping into VR like a lot of fans of Destiny would actually hope. Instead, they're doing a collaboration, and I laughed when I saw this, they're doing a collaboration with Rec Room. Reading the story from Upload VR, and I'll put some images and footage up as I go through this. Part of a collaboration with Bungie, Rec Room's latest crossover will introduce Destiny-themed cosmetics and challenges, alongside a new environment that recreates the tower, the spacefaring shooter's iconic social hub. The main feature of today's update is a new in-game event called Destiny 2 Guardian Gauntlet. In this experience, players can train as Guardians and collaborate with their friends to conquer Destiny-themed adventures. To heighten the immersion, players can put on a hooded cloak and equip a themed weapon skin for the avatar to cosplay as the Destiny 2 Hunter class. But fear not, fellow Warlock mains, as cosmetics based on the remaining Warlock and Titan classes are also coming to Rec Room in the near future. The Destiny 2 update will launch on all VR platforms along with iOS, PlayStation, and Xbox. It will be coming soon to Nintendo Switch. Now, I love this. If you're not familiar with Destiny, it's a sci-fi PvP and PvE shooter. It tends to skew a little bit older, even though the game is free to play, because all of the add-ons for it are paid DLC, and that's where you're going to get more of the game's admittedly pretty thick lore. I've said forever that VR in general has done not a great job of courting the next fan base of gamers, and while some people will disagree with me on that because of the success of games like I Am Cat and Gorilla Tag, in general a lot of these games tend to skew towards a more older audience, even on the Quest itself. And the reality is, a lot of us are going to age out of gaming at some point in our lives, and you need to continually bring new and, more importantly, younger users into it so they grow up on your tech and they grow up in your ecosystem and they remain fans forever. That's been Nintendo's business model for close to 40 years. It's the same model that Sony founded. Most of the people who are PlayStation 5 and 4 owners now are the same people who had PlayStations 1, 2, and 3 when they were young or when they were teenagers, and they just stayed in that ecosystem. VR has not done a great job of that to date because it did have its origins as a PC-only environment before its standalone became a thing, and if you had to be in PC VR, you had to shell out a lot of money. Most parents aren't going to give a kid a $2,000 PC and then a $1,000 headset. That just wasn't going to happen, so a lot of the VR fan base has been fairly old prior to the launch of standalone VR. And as much as people in that age range are not going to want to hear this, VR needs to do whatever it can to cross over to a younger audience so it can endure 10, 20, 30 years from now. So collaborations like this, where you're taking two completely different companies and just merging them into an event, Fortnite for instance are the masters of this. They've had tons and tons of crossovers with all kinds of different intellectual properties, and thus bringing people of different fandoms into their game. I love the fact that Rec Room, which has done events like this in the past, is doing something with a company like Bungie, because you would never expect to see Destiny 2 and Rec Room in the same sentence. I personally haven't logged into Rec Room in probably 2 years now, but I'm actually going to check this out. And when I said this to a couple of friends of mine, one's a little bit younger than me, one's a little bit older than me, they both said, you know what, we got to hop into this. Next story is about the last second, and I mean last second delay of Zero Caliber 2 on Quest. We've seen this game in a bunch of like content creator videos because developers are giving out early access and everything looked really promising. The game was supposed to drop July 11th, which is yesterday as I record this podcast, and that didn't happen. The developers put out a post on X. I'm just going to read through it verbatim. The day we've all been waiting for has not come yet. Zero Caliber 2's Meta Quest release is imminent, but it's not today. We want to ensure you get the bestest experience on standalone VR, so we put the game back into the oven. We're still aiming for a July release. And then replying to some of the comments that they got on this post, basically that it's only going to be like a week or two. They just maybe ran into like a game breaking bug or something like that they had to fix. The last thing we need is a game that's buggy on release, because there are countless examples of games releasing in that state and never actually recovering, or even if they do recover, and there's examples like Hellsweeper and like Bulletstorm are great examples recently of that, their player base doesn't end up returning to the game because first impressions are lasting, and it's a lot easier to get your first round of content creator coverage before you release, as opposed to if you're putting a new update out and the interest is moved on to whatever the new hot thing is. So if the game was in some kind of trouble where they weren't able to release it in the best possible state, then it makes perfect sense to delay it a week or two, even though it sucks that this was last minute. This post went out at 12:06. The game was going to drop at 1 o'clock Eastern, so it's less than an hour before release they pulled it back off the shelf. Wish they had a little bit more advanced notice than that, but better safe than sorry. Next story is about Into the Radius 2. I'm actually on the mailing list for their newsletter, so I'm just going to read the direct email that I got. Explorers, it's official. Get ready to load up your guns, put on your chest rigs, and light up all the cigarettes you can find to gain a bit of stamina. Into the Radius 2 will be entering early access in exactly 2 weeks' time on July 24th. Like the original game, this is just a first stop on the long journey to full release, and this is our first public version of Into the Radius 2. Here's what you can expect from the initial early access launch of the game. 2 new locations plus new UNPSC Explorer facility, that's the home base of the game. 7 top priority missions and a number of secondary missions. 13 weapons, some of which have more than one variant. Several backpack options and 6 types of chest rigs to choose from. A variety of new anomalies and entities. And lastly, single player and 2-player co-op. Anticipating the questions about the Meta Quest port, if there's something to announce, we'll do it. At this point in development, we have nothing to share on that side of things. So this early access release, which will be $40 according to this email, will only be on Steam. The Quest release of Into the Radius came years after the Steam release happened, and there was a great article on Upload VR a few months back about the process of porting a game that large into standalone. The first game also got an amazing Quest 3 update recently that makes it look miles better than the original Quest 2 version. Honestly, I think it's one of the best Quest 3 updates we've gotten out of the well over 100 games that have gotten Quest 3 updates, but stuff like that takes time. And we've seen the perils of games trying to release on multiple platforms at once. Inevitably, you're going to end up with like some pretty major bugs and just stuff that just doesn't really work right. Even in instances where some platforms are delayed over others, like Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 for instance, they still haven't fixed that game, and they released that game on Quest months before they did PSVR 2 and PC VR. So just like Zero Caliber 2 but in another way, I'm glad that they're going to release it on Steam, make it the best possible version it can be, and then port it to other platforms, maybe Quest, maybe PSVR 2 at a later date. Next story is about the new game from nDreams. They're the makers of Synapse, Fract, and Ghostbusters Rise of the Ghost Lord. Reading through the press release here, step into the neon-soaked arena of Frenzies, the stylishly slick multiplayer shooter daring players to embrace their worst selves and dominate the competition. Each 5-round match in Frenzies is a chaotic dip of iconic and unconventional solo and team-based round types, from the tense red light green light to the brilliantly absurd glitter pig. With such a variety of round types in the mix, the experience stays fresh and momentum can swing in an instant, giving every player the chance to strut their stuff. The arena doors will be thrown open for the first time during Frenzy's closed alpha period beginning later this month, where players will have the opportunity to help guide the game's ongoing development. The last thing you can accuse Frenzies of is being boring, said Paul Matram, head of studio at Near Light. Taking inspiration from classics like Quake and Unreal Tournament, we want to inject some unpredictable excitement back into the genre while retaining what makes VR shooters so special. We think Frenzies nails that sweet spot, and then there's an invite to join their Discord if you want to get into the closed alpha session. They cited Unreal Tournament. That was absolutely my jam back in the day, so that alone has me interested in checking this out. I did join their Discord already, so I'm going to be checking out their early alpha if I can get into it. Frankly, I think PvP shooters in VR have kind of become a bit of a dime a dozen, and while we've seen games like Population 1 with their new Phoenix Royale mode, and Contractor Showdown with 60-player lobbies try to do things to innovate that process, because there's only so many times I can play Team Deathmatch or Battle Royale or Capture or Seek and Destroy that I need some new game mode, something to freshen it up. Otherwise, you're just playing the same old stuff over and over and over again, and while that might be fine for some people, me personally, I would like a little bit of variety. So this is one to watch for sure. The gameplay and the tone of the game itself just looks pretty cartoonish, but frankly, if the gameplay is really good, that doesn't really matter. Next up is some info on Metro Awakening from Vertigo Games. There was a post on PlayStation's blog where they had some new screenshots. I'll put that up while I'm talking through this, and some information about the game directly from the developers. I'll read some of these quotes here. One of the first things we did when we embarked upon this project was to reach out to Dmitry Glahovsky. I'm pretty sure I butchered that. We're also almost like we were expecting him to come in and come up with another story for the game that was in line with the other Metro games, but instead he came up with a very, very personal, emotional story for a new character. It also means that our focus started to shift from taking a straightforward approach to a more story-heavy and story-driven approach in this particular game. And of course, the Metro series has always been known for the story that differentiates from other first-person shooters out there. But this time, I think Dmitry really wanted to make sure that the story and development of the characters was even more important. Part of our onboarding process for every team member is to play the game, of course, and so we look at what the strengths are of the franchise, and specifically on which of those strengths are translatable to VR. And some of the things we notice is that the dynamic that they have between stealth and combat, and always making sure you're on your toes, and that you're never really sure when people are going to spot you. That's something that works very, very well in VR. There's just something about creeping up on enemies, listening to what they're talking about. Of course, the nature of VR, you can physically sit behind cover, maybe you can peer through a hole in the cover, and then you can spy on your enemies. But rest assured for everybody that is a little bit more trigger happy, there's plenty of classic Metro action in the game. In Metro Awakening, our protagonist is not necessarily a combat expert. So with that in mind, it fits better to have a bit of a slower pace to the combat versus narrative than the original Metro series. And then one other point here, you're still going to feel the pressure of your bullet count. You're basically constantly looking for ammo. Our artist made sure that there's details to explore, but you also need a reason to explore. And the main reason to explore every nook and cranny is to just find bullets. We figured it'd be best to hide in those small pockets so you don't necessarily find full clips all the time. Instead, you'll be finding single bullets out there, a couple of bullets there, and we've also made an effort to make sure that in some cases there's a bit of environmental storytelling around how the ammo got there and something that triggers your imagination. The philosophy we've taken along for this is also that basically if you look everywhere, you're probably going to have enough bullets to get through your combat encounters. If you just look on the critical path, you will probably have to be a better shot, and if you don't scavenge at all, then you're going to have a hard time. Of course, you can always fall back to stealth. If you're successful at that, then that's always an option. We chose to keep a lot of our UI interactions as diegetic as possible. For example, if you want to see how many bullets you have left in your gun, we could have put a counter on it, but we didn't do that. Instead, we opened up the clips so you can actually see how many bullets are in there. So if you want to know how many bullets are in your clip, you have to pull it out. It's just a bit more immersive when you go into a combat encounter, you're like, okay, let's repair, I'll pull out my clip, check. That's going to be enough for this one. Then you snap it back in. If you want to put on your gas mask, we put it on the backpack. So you pull out your backpack by grabbing it from your shoulder, the gas mask is hanging from it, you just grab it from there and put it to your face, and then you stick it on. Those are the kind of interactions that we are very keen on, just making them as diegetic as possible. This is part of a larger interview that's going to be on the PlayStation podcast that should air sometime today as I record this. I have not heard that podcast yet, so if there's more information, I'll be sure to share it in the later podcast. And the last story is on two other survival games other than Into the Radius, both going into early access. These are from Combat Waffle Studios, the makers of the excellent Ghosts of Tabor. Two games are Silent North and Grim. Now, Grim is a new multiplayer VR survival game, kind of inspired by games like Rust. Reading a bit from Upload VR here, you're tasked with surviving these harsh landscapes as you scavenge the land for resources, crafting new tools, and fending off enemies in PvP and PvE encounters. That takes place across a 16 square kilometer map with a goal for the server capacity to reach 100 players. That's really ambitious. And then there's the official gameplay description. You're washed ashore on a massive island, filled with both lush and harsh landscapes and treacherous terrains, riddled with precious resources necessary for your survival. Find food, water, and materials to construct a secure base and hone your craft. Discover radiated monuments that hold desirable loot, but beware of the wildlife and rival survivors as they pose constant threats and challenge your resilience on the island of Grim. There's no set release window for this, but Combat Waffle is saying that they hope to get it in early access by the end of this year. They do have plans for a PlayStation VR 2 port as well as a port to Meta Quest that will release sometime after that, but it will drop on Steam first. And then there's Silent North. This one's being developed specifically by Combat Waffle Studios. This is an open world survival horror MMO hybrid zombie game. So I got Survival Nation when I first read that description, and I saw a little bit of the gameplay. The gameplay is pretty early alpha if you watch the trailer here, but if you've seen some old Ghosts of Tabor footage versus what the game looks like now, then Silent North clearly has a lot more time left to bake in the oven before we see it later on this year, or maybe even in 2025. With Silent North, we took the core of Tabor and brought in more cartoonish, Walking Dead style cel-shaded art. We're bringing some mechanics people love in Tabor, like mag insertion and backpacks. The backpack systems are a little different now. It's still a physical backpack, and we put it into a much cooler environment that you don't have to grind so hard for. You can just get in and casually play and enjoy it. That's a wrap for this episode. I know that was a lot, occasionally because there's a lot of stories that I don't get to throughout the week. I want to kind of wrap up a whole bunch of like game updates that might be new modes for existing games or upcoming games or game delays, and kind of wrap it into one podcast to give you all the rundown in one fell swoop. You can get Live Open daily on Apple Podcasts, iHeart, Spotify, and YouTube, and check me out on Twitch. I stream VR there several days a week, twitch.tv/liveopenmic. Thanks, and I'll talk to you on Monday.